Monday, November 25th, 1963. And we're originating our program in Washington, where funeral and burial services for John Fitzgerald Kennedy take place today. We'll be on the air for 2.5 hours instead of our customary 2 hours. And with me in the NBC Washington studios is our Washington correspondent, Martin Nagronski. Yesterday began on a numbing note of horror, with millions of Americans as spectators. It built to a moment of intense grief and heart-tugging emotion, and continued on a high emotional note throughout the evening and the morning hours of today, Monday. It began with the fatal shooting of Lee Harvey Oswald, the accused assassin of John Kennedy, by Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner, in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters. Here's how it looked and sounded on live nationwide television. The voice is that of NBC reporter Tom Pettit.
There is Lee Oswald. He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot. There's the man with a gun. It's absolute panic here in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters. The detectives have their guns drawn. Oswald has been shot. There is no question about it. Oswald has been shot.
This remarkable photograph by Bob Jackson of the Dallas Times-Herald was taken a split second after the shot. Oswald, his face contorted, slumped to the floor. He was sped to the same hospital where President Kennedy died. Here's the shooting again in slow motion. Ruby, a well-known police character, burst from the crowd of newsmen and policemen and fired a single bullet at point-blank range into Oswald. Ruby was quickly subdued and later charged with murder. This after Oswald died at the hospital without regaining consciousness. Meanwhile, here in Washington, the high drama of the day had begun. A wheeled caisson, drawn by 6 matched grays, arrived at the north portico of the White House shortly before 1 p.m. There was a 7th horse, a black riderless stallion with reversed boots in the stirrups, symbolic of the dead commander-in-chief. A few minutes after 1 o'clock, with Washington bathed in the light of a cold winter sun, uniformed pallbearers from all of the armed services walked slowly from the White House with the casket containing the body of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The military honor guard snapped to present arms. Civilians bared their heads. Then came Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, pale but composed, holding the hands of daughter Caroline and son John Jr. As the casket was placed atop the caisson, Mrs. Kennedy stared fixedly ahead. She stopped to quiet Caroline and young John, who seemed thankfully unaware of what was happening. To the mournful rattle of muffled drums, the cortege began its slow march out of the White House grounds onto Pennsylvania Avenue and thence to the Capitol, a mile distant. The cadence was a steady 100 steps to the minute. Ahead of the caisson marched the drummers, 3 clergymen, a color guard, and a detachment of sailors. And flanking the flag-draped casket was an honor guard from all the armed services: Marines, soldiers, airmen, Coast Guardsmen, and sailors. Always the sound of drums. Along Constitution Avenue to the Capitol Plaza, the cortege made its way through silent crowds 10 and 12 deep. Police estimated the throng at more than 300,000, many of whom had stood waiting for hours since before dawn. At the Capitol, as the Navy band played the Navy hymn, the casket was lifted from the caisson, carried into the rotunda, and placed on the Lincoln catafalque. Mrs. Kennedy, her face drawn and tired, but miraculously still composed, followed close behind and took her place among the mourners. She stood stiff and erect as the eulogies echoed through the chamber, from Senator Mansfield, Chief Justice Warren, and Speaker McCormick. And then the collective heart of the nation missed 1, 2, 3 beats as Mrs. Kennedy and Caroline walked slowly to the bier. They knelt, the 2 heads bowed as one. And then Mrs. Kennedy leaned forward and kissed the flag on her husband's casket. Mother and daughter rose and walked slowly then with immense dignity back to their places. It was a scene that was repeated 7 hours later when Mrs. Kennedy returned to the rotunda, knelt at the bier, and again kissed the flag on the casket. By then it was night here in Washington, and the temperature was inching down toward the freezing mark. But in the darkness, the people moved. By the thousands, they formed a patient, silent column, 4 abreast and up to 9 miles long, as they waited to say farewell to their late president. 50 a minute, they climbed the steps of the east portico of the Capitol and shuffled into the rotunda, flowing around the bier and its guard of honor in twin, unending streams. By midnight, it was said that 100,000 persons had passed through the rotunda. By 9 o'clock this morning, when the public viewing is to cease, the total is expected to pass 250,000. Many were young people, some children carried by their parents. There were teenagers, college students, young men and women. To the young, especially to the young, the loss of John Fitzgerald Kennedy was a blow they seemed unwilling to concede. Some spoke of waiting 9, 10 hours in the biting cold. No one complained. There were tears, murmured prayers, compassionate smiles, and quick, fretful glances. There was respect, awe, humility, and an almost visible bond of love that reached out from these silent lines to the quiet casket. In death, as in life, John F. Kennedy was where he most wanted to be, among the people of the United States. Crowds are still passing the flag-draped casket of President Kennedy in the rotunda of the Capitol here in Washington. And they're expected to go marching past until 9 a.m. today. We will be returning to the rotunda throughout our program, which will continue for the next 2.5 hours. As I said earlier, with me here in the Washington studios today is our own NBC correspondent, Martin Nagronski, and he and I will be interviewing a number of our national leaders throughout the morning. It does seem, in a way, like several weeks since Friday noon.
It still seems unbelievable when you, all night long, anyone who stayed up all night long, our cameras have been there in the rotunda, and these people have walked by the thousands, the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands. It's noticeable there was little crying in the rotunda itself. The tears came for many as they walked slowly out and left behind that flag-draped coffin. And it seemed then that the awareness came, and the tears too. Awareness that in that casket there lay still forever, tragically, needlessly, wastefully dead, that vibrant, vital man who'd drawn so prodigally on his boundless energy to provide this country with a distinguished and courageous leadership. I covered the funeral of Franklin D. Roosevelt. It was a different kind of feeling. There was more of a personal involvement, I remember then. People cried as they stood in the streets. It's a different sort of a feeling here. Roosevelt, after all, was a man who had been president of the United States then for almost 13 years, and there was more of a personal involvement. And I think that the feeling of grief here was a feeling that derives primarily from a promise unfulfilled, from a youth and a life cut off in the prime. And it reflects itself in the mood and the attitude. There's very little anyone can say about it. Beyond that, I think that the tribute that was demonstrated in this night-long procession that continues still is